What's going on, guys? A little while ago, I put out a video basically laying out how I'm thinking about the problem of evil. I'm kind of breaking it up into two parts, basically temporary psychological change and permanent psychological change. And for me, it's just easier to tackle two small problems of evil rather than one big one. And what I want to do is I want to try and ruggedize it a little bit. I want to try and put it into a syllogism and kind of lay out some assumptions. It's like, how would I actually make the argument, right? I kind of laid out how I've been thinking about it in the other video at a high level, and I kind of illustrated some concepts, but how would I actually defend it? And so what I want to do today is defend the first one, really. Try and ruggedize and syllogize this temporary psychological change, and how do we answer that problem of evil? So, temporary psychological change. Basically, the question is, why would a good God allow temporary psychological change, right, or temporary pain or negative affect, right? Why would a good God allow these things? This could be anything from someone said something mean to me, and it just kind of initiated that little transient of pain in my brain. It could be stubbing my toe, or it could be something as bad as, getting crucified, if that's going to be a little foreshadowing of what's to come. The way I want to tackle this is, if God experiences this type of suffering himself, does that answer this problem of evil? And that's really the Christian answer. And that's kind of what I want to lay out, is that it does, and how so. So the syllogism itself is, first premise, God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, and has himself experienced temporary psychological suffering, right? This is just the Jesus case. Premise two, if all that's true, if Jesus did come and experience this type of evil, then temporary psychological suffering is justified categorically. And what I mean by that is, if Jesus came and suffered, that must have meant it was worth it for him. But not only that, it's justified for everyone else as well. And then the third premise is temporary psychological suffering, as a category, is itself justified. And we've defended half the problem of evil, or answered it, I guess. So how do we actually go about defending it? Well, the first premise is really just the Christian assumption. I'm not really interested in defending Christianity here. What I want to do is, sort of. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to determine whether or not the problem of evil crashes Christianity into the ground, right? That's what the problem of evil logically is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to invalidate Christianity or invalidate the belief of a loving God. So I'm not really trying to defend the existence of a loving God. I'm just trying to determine whether or not this crashes that into the ground. So I'm not defending the Christian assumption. I'm just stating it. The second premise is where all the action is. Why would Jesus's temporary suffering justify his own suffering along with the suffering of everyone else, right? If I could answer that question, then I've defended the second premise. So what I would start with observing is that temporary pain, so what I'm talking about, temporary pain versus permanent psychological damage. Temporary psychological damage or temporary pain results from just basically neutral aspects of the world interacting together in an awkward way. For example, if you stub your toe, you're talking about toes and you're talking about some kind of block that you stub it on. These are all neutral things, and they just happen to interact in a way that was unpleasant, right, to your conscious experience. And I would distinguish this from permanent psychological suffering. So when you have permanent psychological suffering, I would say that's you have the world interacting in a way that causes pain to your consciousness, but it's not only that. The thing that makes it permanent is you come away from that pain with a disordered misinterpretation of the world. So in other words, if you go through some trauma, maybe you go to war, maybe you get PTSD, or maybe you're abused or something, and you have some kind of trauma from that. Once the pain itself, once the immediate situation itself is resolved, and once you're physically safe, you're still damaged somehow for the rest of your life. And what I think the damage is basically the story you tell yourself about the situation. So there's the situation itself, and then there's the story you tell about it. And maybe that's a callous way of putting it, but I think that's true. Like, the thing that continues the suffering in a traumatic, permanent way is the story, is the narrative we have about it in our heads, which continues the suffering and makes it permanent. But that's not in the scope of this argument. I'm just distinguishing here. So again, temporary pain is just neutral aspects of the world interacting. So maybe it's, your toe in a block, or maybe it's, to kind of foreshadow here, your hand in a nail in a piece of wood. But the next thing I want to say is a world where such interactions are possible was worth living in. And that's what I mean by categorically justified, right? If God himself entered into this world, and if God is all good, and if he's all knowing, and if he's all loving, and if he's all powerful, he wouldn't enter into the world and if it wasn't worth living in. Now, this is different from creating the world in the first place, right? So I'm trying to frame this argument in a fresh way here. I'm not just talking about would God have created the world. I'm talking about would God have entered into the world. And I think, if he was all powerful and all good, and all knowing, he wouldn't subject himself to unnecessary suffering, right? So that's what I think. If God entered into the world and subjected himself to these unpleasant interactions which caused pain, that must mean that experience was intrinsically valuable in a good way, right? Not in a bad way. And so that's basically how I would defend it. Kind of quick and dirty, but that's how I would do it. I think the obvious question, like philosophically, is if God is all knowing, all powerful, and all good, then isn't the world he created and the suffering in it, isn't that just simply a good thing by definition, right? If God is all good, all loving, all powerful, wouldn't the world he creates automatically be good, right? And why don't I just leave it at that, right? Why do I have to add this premise of God enters into the world? And the reason I'm talking about this is, like, historically, to kind of back up a second, like, this is the Jewish answer, by the way. Like, if you don't assume that God himself walked the earth, right, you just have to trust him. You have to trust that, the world is ordered for good at the end of the day. Like, good wins over evil. You have to just trust that, right? But what I'm saying is, and the reason I'm bringing Jesus into the picture, and why would I bring in Jesus to resolve the problem of evil, is basically the question. And the question I would pose in return is, A or B? Is it better to argue in a vacuum? And what I mean by that is, you could answer the problem of evil purely logically. Like, maybe you can come up with an argument that answers the problem of evil purely logically. And maybe you might have Aquinas as, the poster boy of this. Or, A or B. So A is just purely logically answer the problem of evil. Or B, can we answer the problem of evil logically in a way that addresses the compassionate and sort of Emmanuel nature of God? And what I mean by that is compassion means to suffer with, and Emmanuel means God is with us. So is God with us, suffering with us? And that seems like a very compassionate thing. And if God is not only allowing this evil, but he's experiencing it with us, if he's experiencing pain and suffering with us, there is something spiritual to that which helps us trust him, right? So the real problem of evil, like emotionally and spiritually, forget about the logic, emotionally and spiritually, the problem of evil is all about trusting God, and I can't believe God would allow these things to happen to me, right? That's kind of the oomph of the problem of evil argument. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to address the oomph. I'm trying to address the bite, right? I'm not just trying to answer logically. I'm trying to defang the argument and answer it logically at the same time. Like, I want to keep this open revolving door between the logic stuff, but also the emotion and heart stuff. If we could do both at the same time, isn't that just better than just having a logical answer, right? So if you could pick between an argument that just addresses the logic or an argument that addresses the logic in a way that sort of addresses your spiritual concerns, isn't that second way of arguing better? And that's what I'm trying to do here, is I'm trying to frame this argument in a way that you can kind of plug in your experiences into. And that's what I mean by evangelically compelling. Like, how do saints, right? I assume the saints who suffered and suffered a lot, they must have internalized their suffering in just a healthy way. Like if they have an experience where they're suffering, they don't come away with this destructive attitude, like this sense that the world, life sucks and you die, right? That's not how saints come away with an experience of suffering. They come out with an experience of suffering in such a way that they're able to put the suffering in context of some kind of broader sense of purpose, and somehow they don't come away with trauma. They come away with this sense of I'm suffering, for a purpose, or at least this suffering is not destroying me. And that's how saints, I think, come away with that. And how can we frame the actual philosophical arguments and the logical reasons why God is compatible with this? Like the concept of a loving God is compatible with this whole story. The saints are a microcosm of this philosophy. Like the saints are the embodiment of the answer of the problem of evil in many cases. But how do we actually formally talk about that? And that's really what I'm driving at here. So can this saintly way just be reflected in our response to the problem of evil, but in our philosophy towards suffering more broadly? And can that sort of Catholic philosophy let that be the answer to the problem of evil, rather than some abstract, I've just answered the logical problem and we could deal with the messy spirituality of people separately? No. I want to philosophize about the actual saints. I want to philosophize about how do I actually navigate suffering and evil in a healthy way. Right? I want to philosophize at that level about that. I don't just want to answer the logical problem of evil because I'm not a robot. Anyway, so more to come. I want to talk about the second half of the problem of evil. This is the first half. Let me know what you think. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.